Today, I'm going to share with you what I see as the top four, at least for today. This could change day by day, but the top four federal monstrosities that absolutely gotta go. And when it comes to taking on the empire, the largest government in history, the hardest part was just keeping it to four. But let's get right to this, and I'm sure you're not going to be surprised to see this one on the list. But I want to start out with the central bank, the Federal Reserve, which is the engine that funds and powers the largest government in history. And here from an article by Mike Maharrey that I've cited many times on this show, Mike writes that monetary policy runs through the Fed, enables much of the U.S. government's excessive borrowing and spending. If the federal government had to rely on tax receipts and borrowing that it could actually repay to fund all of its unconstitutional wars, and that's a great caveat, that it could actually repay, which it can't today, to fund all of its unconstitutional wars, foreign aid, domestic spending, and the like, it would be dead in the water. Mike says the ability to raise revenue through taxation and free market borrowing would naturally limit the government. But with the Fed backstopping it all by monetizing the debt, there are virtually no limits on its spending. And it keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And he says, given the enormous role the Fed plays in the American system of government, you would expect to find it explicitly authorized by the Constitution. But of course, it is not. And there was a debate over the first bank of the United States right out of the gate, 1791, just a few years after the Philadelphia Convention, after the ratification debates. Hamilton's brainchild, of course, was a central bank, and it was vehemently opposed by people. Unfortunately, they failed: Thomas Jefferson, Edmund Randolph, James Madison, and others. And Jefferson warned that even if you thought this was not a huge deal, because at the time it was only going to be around for a certain amount of time and it would expire. And some people were making the case, oh, it's not a huge deal. But Jefferson warned that as soon as you allow them to go beyond the Constitution, you create a really massive problem. He said to take a single step beyond the boundaries, I think this is wrong in the image here, beyond the boundaries thus specially drawn, Jefferson wrote, around the powers of Congress, is to take possession of a boundless field of power. In other words, as long as those limits don't matter, as long as they can be changed based on a political situation, then you might as well give them unlimited power. And it may not have gone from where they were a single step beyond the limits of the Constitution with the first bank to unlimited power, but it set the foundation for it. A single step beyond the Constitution is a step too far. Now, Mike Maharrey wrote an entire handbook. I forget how many pages, a few dozen pages. It's not a really long one, but it goes into the history of that and how it set the stage for much of the monster state of today. And I'm going to link to it in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty, along with some other source documents, articles, episodes, and the like that I'm mentioning in this episode. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And here from the overview of the book, The National Bank versus the Constitution. If you understand the constitutional arguments against the first bank of the U.S., you will have a solid grasp on the constitutional arguments against much of the unconstitutional monster state we live under today. Now, one way that states and individuals can push back against the Federal Reserve and take steps to nullify it in practice and effect is by legalizing or merely just using things as money that aren't from the Federal Reserve, whether it's the paper funny money, that fiat trash that they foist upon us and devalue year in and year out and use to fund all of their garbage, or the next version, which is going to be the total control grid, which is the central bank digital currency version. Whatever you want to use, as long as it's not part of that system, you're helping take a small step towards liberty. Here at TAC, our favorite tends to be goldback.com. I will link to that so you can read about it. This is the description from their website. It's the world's first physical interchangeable gold money that is designed to accommodate even small transactions. So whatever you're using, let's all work together to nullify the Fed into oblivion where it belongs. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is unconstitutional war powers. And the founding generation, surprise, surprise, because they lived through it, they did not want to see permanent, endless warfare state. And here, James Madison in Political Observations, 1795, warning why. He said, of all the enemy, mind you, this is not some hippy-dippy from Berkeley or from my old neighborhood in downtown LA telling you this. This is from the father of the Constitution, or at least so-called father of the Constitution, James Madison himself. He said, of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes, and armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for putting the many under the domination of the few. And we absolutely have a trifecta on that today: armies and debts and taxes. That's from James Madison. Here from P.A. Deacon in an article from a few years ago. He said the political class uses war to centralize power and change culture. Now, if you listen to my episode a few days ago talking about striking the root at consolidation. Consolidation, the term the founders used for centralizing all power basically into one. Patrick Henry and so many others warned us against this as the great root cause of so many of our problems that we live under today. He said, Patrick Henry specifically said, consolidation must end in the destruction of our liberty. So when P.A. Deacon points out that they use war to centralize power, that's how they manipulate the culture. That's how they manipulate their control. And all of us, he said, war is the tool of the power elite to subjugate a nation. And that is exactly what James Madison was saying so many years earlier. And here again from Madison, he said, in war too, this is again goes to centralized power. In war too, Madison wrote, the discretionary power of the executive is extended. Its influence in dealing out offices, honors, and emoluments is multiplied, and all the means of seducing the minds are added to those of subduing the force of the people. No nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. That's James Madison. I think it should be very powerful stuff. I know I've cited it on this show many times, but it can never be repeated enough, especially until things change. Now, we've been getting close to a full century where Congress, the executive branch, the courts, the states, almost everybody has basically been ignoring and letting them get away with the division of war powers under the Constitution. I'm not going to get into the details on this, but they just have not been following. It's not even close. I did an episode a couple of years ago, The Power to Declare War and Introduction. And here from the overview, only Congress has the power to declare war. That means change the state of things from peace to war. It's not something, what they do most of the time, just the short version of this, is what they generally do is say, hey, we're saying you can use force, but you make the determination, executive branch. So really what they're doing is they're passing the buck to the executive branch to do the declaring of war as defined by the Constitution. And they're trying to get away with it as well. People let them. But how it's used today has almost no resemblance to the original legal meaning in the Constitution. I will link to that in the show notes. And because, as Madison told us, war comprises and develops the germ of every other, I think my view is that the things that people and states can do to take on the empire is really anything that reduces the power of the central government in Washington, D.C. Each of those things really chips away at it. Even if it has nothing to do with the warfare state, it really reduces their power, makes things more difficult. But there are some direct things, at least on the state level, that can be done as well. For example, the Defend the Guard Act. I'm going to link to an episode that I did on that in November of 2022. Defend the Guard, support the Constitution, resist the empire. It's a state-level bill that helps establish or helps affirm the use of the Guard only in times where Congress and the executive branch are following the Constitution, war powers. So really, really important stuff. So war powers is number 2. Number 3, well, federal gun control and the ATF. Let's at least look at that. We can deal with other gun control at other levels on other days. But here from Roger Sherman in the House of Representatives, 1790, it is the privilege of every citizen and one of his most essential rights to bear arms and to resist every attack upon his liberty or property by whomsoever made. Now, that is an essential right of everyone in the United States. Also, James Wilson, one of the first associate justices on the Supreme Court, I believe he actually taught the first kind of constitutional law class, somewhere 1789 or 1790 as well. He said the defense of oneself, justly called the primary law of nature, is not, nor can it be abrogated by any regulation of municipal law. And I guess we're addressing all levels of gun control there as well. Here, James Madison put it this way: because it is a natural right. It doesn't matter. They could remove the Second Amendment, and I know we're gonna see them try to do that. That doesn't mean you no longer have the right to keep and bear arms. You have the right to keep and bear arms by the nature of your birth. The Second Amendment isn't your gun permit. You are. Of course, governments hate the right to keep and bear arms, and James Madison understood this as well. He said governments are afraid to trust the people with arms. And they're not going to fire themselves. But ultimately, the only thing under the Constitution that the ATF is authorized to do is disband. So it's going to be essential for the people and the states to reject, resist, and nullify the ATF into oblivion. And I did an episode, of course, on that as well, January of 2022, 4 essential steps to nullify federal gun control. That will also be linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And last up for today, our buddies at the DEA. And here from an episode that I did, Constitution on the Constitution on the War on Drugs. Few programs have done such consistent and sweeping damage to the original legal meaning of the Constitution as the so-called war on drugs. And a lot of people who are in support of the right to keep and bear arms are okay with the war on drugs, and vice versa. And really, these two, the DEA and the ATF, work so closely together, they might as well be the same organization. The ATF does all kinds of war on drugs work, and the DEA does all kinds of gun control. These people are partners. They have no authority under the Constitution to even have those jobs. Again, the only thing they're authorized to do is disband. Here from a great article, almost 20 years old, by an old friend, Anthony Gregory, over at Future of Freedom Foundation. And he talks about this as well. He said the title is Gun Control and the War on Drugs, because he recognizes, well, which so few people seem to recognize today, how closely linked they are. He said many opponents of gun control support the war on drugs, and many critics and reformers of America's drug laws tend to believe in gun control. Conservatives tend to fall in the first category and liberals in the second. Now, some of us here we hate it all. It's all terrible. In reality, Anthony writes, these two issues are more similar than many people might think. And he gets into kind of the philosophical view about, well, if you can't choose what you're going to purchase and own and keep in your own home, then it's really the philosophical underlying principle is the same as well. But he also points out the practical end. He said the relationship between drug prohibition and gun control goes way back. The organized crime of Al Capone and the mafia, which flourished as a result of alcohol prohibition, was the inspiration and rationale for the first major federal gun control measure, the National Firearms Act of 1934. So they're very intricately tied together. They always have been. They've always been tools, one of the other. Anthony goes on. 3 years after passing the NFA, which shouldn't exist, of course, the federal government passed the most sweeping national drug law since alcohol prohibition, the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, followed a year later by the Federal Firearms Act of 1938. Politicians, he writes, stretched the Commerce Clause of the Constitution to pass both of these blatantly unconstitutional laws. And it has been getting worse and worse and worse. It's interesting to see how they're connected right from the beginning. And in the last few years here, our work here at the TAC, when we tried to work with states to get Second Amendment Preservation Acts passed, which merely tell states, where the states say they're not going to participate in the enforcement of either all or some or various federal gun control measures. And you would think that the number one opponents to that would be, the hard left gun grabber types, the Bloombergs and things like the Everytowns. But actually, their opposition has not been all that aggressive. The worst opposition that we've had, most consistent, most well-funded, most aggressive, has been law enforcement. And the number one complaint that they always file, the one that they do in hearings and in public testimony and in articles and in letters to legislators who are considering this is, well, We love having federal gun control measures and federal gun laws as leverage in the war on drugs. They use it as basically a force multiplier. Hey, turn in your buddy or you're going to get an extra 10, 15 years for this gun charge. So they love using these together, and they absolutely have been tied together since day one. And just like the ATF, the only thing that the DEA is authorized to do under the Constitution is disband. But we can get a lot of lessons from what has happened on the state, local, and individual level against the federal government and even the states when it comes to the war on drugs. And we can take this strategy and apply it to the ATF and probably pretty much everything else it should be. And here from another episode that I will link to in the show notes, Lessons from Nullifornia. It's a 50-year history of efforts by the state to nullify the feds, efforts by the cities to nullify the state, and individuals to nullify them all. Now, ultimately, it's up to the people to protect and defend their own constitution and their own liberty, whether the government happens to like it or not. As John Dickinson put it in 1788, he said, it's the supreme sovereignty of the people. He said, it is their duty to watch and their right to take, it is their duty to watch and their right to take care that the Constitution be preserved, or in the Roman phrase on perilous occasions, that the Republic receive no damage. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I hope it got you to think. Of course, I'm going to link to all this stuff in the show notes, which I've mentioned many times in the show. But if you want to help us get this kind of message out to more people, absolutely nothing helps us roll up our sleeves every single day and support the Constitution and liberty and teach people how to defend both when government refuses to do so, which is 24/7, 365. Nothing helps us do that work more than the financial faith and support of our members. So while we're talking here about nullifying the Fed, if you want to get rid of some of that dirty government fiat, throw it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Our membership program starts out at just $2 a month. I really appreciate any consideration you can give to joining us today. I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you have a great day, a great weekend, and I hope to see you next week here on the path to liberty.